Whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming and for your interest in learning about invasive plants. I think Bobby and I are two very passionate people about trying to get the word out so we have a better understanding of how they're impacting the environment and wildlife. And so what I hope to do, I've got samples. It took me not long at all to just, some of these are roadside, some of these are plantings at different buildings, but to kind of give you a flavor of what's out there. I could go through a long laundry list of problematic plants. I'm going to introduce a few and hope that they illustrate why the invasives are a problem, and particularly for, you know, displacing wildlife, etc. So I'll get started. My name is Joanne Rebeck. I was a research scientist with the Forest Service, but in the Midwest and northern part of the U.S. But I'm a graduate of NC State, where I really have a PhD in botany and really fell in love with Western North Carolina. So it took me about 35 years for my husband and I to get back to North Carolina. My husband's a native of Wake County. My oldest son's an alum of UNCA, so we've spent a lot of time here in the mountains. So I really also want to weave in, you know, the specific impacts on wildlife, and just to kind of highlight what I'm going to talk about. You know, so how do we define an invasive species? Why should we even care about it? How do they impact wildlife? And again, why they're here, looking at some of their biology and ecology, and to highlight some of the top offenders in our area. And what can we do? I mean, it's a sad, it could be very depressing, but we do, if we can all engage, we can definitely make an impact. And then also to share, probably most importantly, you know, there are a plethora of resources out there, and it's really overwhelming. So hopefully I curated some of the good resources, and Shauna and I talked. This presentation will be available. She's going to put it online, so then you can just click, you know, a live link if you're interested in some of the resources. So the definition that I'm going to use from the USDA is it's both non-native. It's able to quickly establish itself on a wide range of sites. It grows very quickly, and it disrupts plant communities or whole ecosystems. But keep in mind that just because a plant is non-native doesn't mean that it's invasive. There are some native plants that can be considered invasive too. I might add a caveat. When I get into where a lot of these plants came from, a lot of our native plants were transported to those countries, to Asia, to Europe. And like an example, northern red oak is an invasive plant in Europe, which, and a good part of my research career was studying how we can maintain oaks in our forests. And how I got into invasives research when I was studying oak regeneration, I was finding all these invasive plants out in the forests, and they were interfering with oak establishment. So why are they successful? So they often produce copious amounts of seeds at a very young age. Some plants, an Ailanthus, I'll talk about that. There were reports it was less than a year old. This is a tree, and it was producing seeds. They often have very long flowering and fruiting periods. And here's a big one, the dispersal, the movement occurs often by birds, wind, and humans. And the bird and wind part is really difficult to control, but we as humans could certainly play a part in reducing their spread. They thrive, they do really well on very disturbed sites. And you probably notice now driving along the highway, and especially if you take 26 north of here, the purple flowered Polonia is on a lot of where the highway had been blasted through. Very, what's going to grow on almost bare rock. Polonia is an example. And often they have incredible root systems that just exclude everything else, and they grow very quickly. That's another trait. And those root systems can smother, you know, other roots of other vegetation. And even some of them produce chemicals. You may be familiar with black walnut, where you don't plant tomatoes near, because there are chemicals that are naturally produced by that plant that inhibits the germination and growth of other plants. Ailanthus, this one right here is a good example. It produces chemicals that limit the establishment of other plants. Garlic mustard, a little herbaceous plant, is another example. So what happens? These plants were introduced from another place, but their natural predators often didn't come with them. So they have escaped predation, feeding, diseases, etc. So they are thriving. Another trait that you might observe is often they leaf out very early in the spring and hold on to their leaves well into the fall. So they're capturing more time to collect energy. And as I said earlier, so they're easily established after a disturbance. This is, we had a driveway redone, and when they brought the gravel in, this is a microstegium, Japanese stilt grass came in, and I was pulling it along the edge of my driveway. And that was about less than a year after they had done the work. So how and where did they come from? So a lot of those were intentional. Garlic, mustard, and wineberry were brought from Europe. For both medicinal and for food. So many, most of them are here for horticultural reasons. People planted them in their yards, their landscapes, and they escaped. And we'll talk about some of these. Kudzu, you live in the state of North Carolina, are well familiar with that plant. And that was actually brought in for erosion control and for forage for livestock, autumn olive, wildlife food. And then some of the other came in, Japanese stilt grass. It was actually packing material for China, porcelain ware from Asia. And unfortunately, well, the majority of them, as I mentioned earlier, these plants came from Asia and Europe. So why do we care about these non-native invasive plants? Well, money talks. 100, and this is probably a few years old, I'm sure it's gone up, $120 billion annually. That's just for invasive plants. We're not even touching invasive animals, insects, etc., snails, zebra mussels, etc. We don't even know what's out there. So here's the doom part. I'll get to more upbeat, hopefully, at the end. But so we're talking about over 4,000 species. And so more than a quarter of them actually pose a threat. And they reduce diversity of systems. They impact food webs. So disrupt the insects that birds eat, caterpillars that birds eat, etc. and they actually will exclude wildlife from areas. And even more disturbing, so some of the large impact on federally endangered and threatened species in the US are at risk. And I had to throw in, and all the predictions as far as invasive plants are going to be even more threatening to our systems because of climate change. There's been lots of studies done that shows that this disruptive climate is actually going to facilitate the spread and establishment of these plants. So why are they bad for wildlife? There have been studies that have demonstrated that the nutritional quality of these berries, because they, oh, look at those beautiful berries, the birds are going to love those, when actually the nutritional quality can be quite lower than some of their native counterparts. This is bush honeysuckle, and some work was done in Ohio looking at how that changed the color eating those berries of the cardinals, the male cardinals, and how that impacted mating. As I mentioned before, they can displace native plants, which then the native plants are fed upon by insects. So those numbers of insects that the birds eat can be impacted negatively. Branching patterns, if you think about what a shrub looks like, sometimes these invasive shrubs might be more open. Birds nest in there, that they may be more visible to predators. So the young hatchlings could be eaten. Studies demonstrate that butterfly habitat can be negatively impacted when there's a large density of invasive shrubs in a forest. The leaf and stem, every fall for these deciduous shrubs, when they hit a stream, those are so critical for all the invertebrates that live in the stream, which the fish eat. And there's been research that clearly shows how that directly affects the food for fish. And then the animals that eat insects that help consuming the problem insects can be impacted. So looking at the invasive plants, out in the forest, a lot of it has to do with what the site has looked like and what the timeline is. So in interior forests, oftentimes you think, oh, the invasives can't get in there. But whether or not it's an evergreen or deciduous forest, was it a former pasture? Was there a home site? A lot of times home sites that become abandoned, a forest grows up around it. Say somebody in the 1930s planted an ailanthus tree. Well, you come back 50 years later, 100, almost not quite 100 years later, but 70, 80 years later, and the ailanthus is spread out. I've demonstrated that in some research that I've done in the past. So all the sites are really important as far as what's going to come in and how bad the infestation is going to be, as well as what happened on that landscape. As I mentioned, some of those different sites. And then whether it's a dry site, like a ridge top in a forest, or a moist or a wetlands. And they are poised and ready to come in with a disturbance. Say there's a timber harvesting, a road put in, those seeds can remain in the soil. It depends, some for decades. So a resource which is really wonderful, the North Carolina Invasive Plant Council, they've come up with a list of plants by regions, and you can learn more about the list, and just to kind of give you a flavor for what we're talking about. So this is the list for Western North Carolina. So they've identified trees, shrubs, and vines. I'll touch on a few of these starred ones, and then look at all the potential herbaceous plants. So things like garlic mustard, Japanese stilt grass, that are considered very problematic in the state. So just a few to highlight to give you an idea of why specifically species or problems. I'll touch on some of these. We know, and I've got samples, not of all of these, but bittersweet, and a little information about that, some of the other ones. Please feel free to take a look at it later. So it's a woody perennial vine. It's shade tolerant. We know that they're often used ornamentally. A lot of wreaths are made with them. You know, they're beautiful, showy fruit, and the flowers are numerous. And they can grow on a wide range of habitats. Unfortunately, they will grow up into the canopy. They girdle trees. They shade out, and anything growing on the forest floor. I have seen some that are about this big around, and the whole complete forest is occupied by them. Here's a picture of, you know, its handiwork. Over at Bailey Mountain, if you've ever hiked up through there, right behind the barns, that whole slope is loaded with bittersweet. It is the only, I've looked for what regulations there were in North Carolina for controlling these. And right now there aren't banned, I couldn't find banned plants, but this is considered a noxious weed. They have class A, B, and C, but class C is basically the state says we cannot eradicate it. Not that they've thrown up their hands, but you can control it in small patches, but it is well established here. I did a lot of research on Ailanthus. I could always get on my soapbox. Let's not call it tree of heaven, because that's the common name. You know, the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, that centers around Ailanthus. If you come up and when I cut this morning, this was right outside the library, the smell is putrid. So I've been for probably about 20 years trying to get people to just call it stink tree. With limited success. But these seeds, hundreds of thousands of seeds on one female tree. They do have male and female trees. And research that I personally did, I did an experiment for up to 6 to 5 years, thinking those seeds wouldn't be still viable and able to germinate, and actually found that there still were some that were viable. So it exceeds 5 years, those seeds. So if you went in, there was a disturbance, you had removed the tree and all the seeds. If there were some seeds on the surface or maybe in the soil, they could germinate. And these were brought here, they've really become naturalized. It's a huge problem since, you know, the late 1874 was when they first came. Here's what can happen. That is a pure thicket of Ailanthus. Can you imagine anything, you know? And plus they have these chemicals that inhibit other species. So you basically, it's like a field of Ailanthus. And it is very, very problematic in trying to establish new forests. As I mentioned, oftentimes it's confused with sumac, but all you have to do is just break off a leaflet and smell it. And it is a real problem. I'm working on a some of the last research I did was a biocontrol for Ailanthus. There's a native fungus that lives in the soil. And colleagues are working on getting approval through EPA to have it as a biocide chemical treatment. We're still a few years out, and COVID really set us back as well. But there will be a control for this, which will be available for the public to control Ailanthus, hopefully in a few years down the road. And it has almost no off-target effects, so other plants are not affected by it. So there's some of the hopefulness that we can find different tools than chemical treatments, which are good in the right place at the right time. Another problematic one that was brought here for living fences, for wildlife, to create wildlife habitat, and they do serve, you know, their purpose. They have these vitamin C rich rose hips, but they can definitely, you know, take over an area and displace all kinds of native plants. And they're, as a human walking through the forest, who wants to get tangled up with Multiflora Rose? I don't really need to say much about kudzu. We all know what a problem that is. But again, it was brought here intentionally. If you have some goats or some livestock, you know, you want to feed them, this would be a good source of food. But you can see this, I think I took this over in Asheville near AD Tech. I was happy to see they're starting to try to clean that up. So a little closer to home, I know you're all, I mean, what can I say, except that I do have a flyer here. Bo Dossett, he's the county forester, put together this, and he wants to rename it wildfire grass because it is such a problem as far as for fuel for wildfires. And it's on Bone Camp a couple of years ago, a fire, and it came very close to destroying some structures. But you know, it was brought here. It's got a number of different names, but I encourage you, if you want to learn a little bit more and what you can do to get rid of it, I'll leave those by the door.
Burning is not recommended for that, is it? I've noticed that when people try to burn that, it seems to activate the seed rather than destroy it.
Exactly. You are actually you stimulate it. I try to study on my own property because if you live in Madison County and you have any property, you likely have it. I tried burning, you know, cutting off all this material, you know, the dried material, burning, doing a spot burning, didn't help at all. I did herbicide treatment too, just very, and it's got to be, I think the most effective way is just when you can just keep cutting it until you can deplete all the energy in the root systems that get stored there. Yeah, fire, not.
It wasn't that brought in by the
This, no, this was brought in as an ornamental. People started planting it on their properties and it escaped. And the reason you see it a lot on the highways is because those are very open areas. There's a lot of disturbance, so there's lots of sunlight and they can get established, and these seeds can get blown around, and then their root systems. So again, yeah, it is such a problem, but trying to stay on top of it. I know I've talked to some landowners that are working with Bo Dossett, and where they can mow on a regular basis, that's what they're doing to try to control it. But, you know, we've got some really steep areas here that you can't mow. I would love to see some goats, I was hoping to get somewhere down the road, as a test, at Bailey Mountain, because there's, at the preserve at Smith Farm, there's a lot of miscanthus there. And if we could use and see if we could control it with grazing by goats. But that's down the road a few years. But it's still being sold out in the community, and that's a problem. In trying to educate these establishments not to sell them. I approached Evereens Creek. They were selling a variety of it, and it didn't. I tried to be very kind about it, but it, needless to say, didn't go well.
Are they trying to pass it off as muley grass?
No, muley grass is a different, and that's a native grass.
Some of the grasses we're seeing native.
And that's the thing, understanding there are some really wonderful alternatives. Muley grass would be, if you like, and I love ornamental native grasses. I actually have a prairie that I'm starting on the top, the ridge of my property right by my house. And so I have muley grass. There's little blue stem, there's big blue stem, there's Indian grass. There are a lot of beautiful native grasses that we need to plant instead of things like miscanthus, or is it pacus grass is another one that's even taller than that. So, and understanding and learning what alternatives there are, native alternatives, is another big piece. And there is a piece of information there, and you can find it on the internet. What are alternatives, native alternatives to some of these plants? So some of the other species that are problematic, thanks to Bobby, we actually had Bradford calorie pears here, and those were removed. I've got samples of all these. I mean, if you look at the calorie pear, so we have many different cultivars now out there. So they were, when they were first brought as ornamentals, they were told they were self-sterile. Well, now we have these different varieties, and they can cross-pollinate each other. So now, I mean, look at this, it's May. I got this yesterday. All these fruit, the birds eat them, and it is spread everywhere. And it is becoming a huge problem that we need to address now before it gets worse. And I'll get into that a little bit. So I don't know about you, but I think the flowers smell horrible. They're just awful. And the birds, you know, transport it all over. This, I don't know how clear you can see this. This was an old agricultural field that had been abandoned, and it was near a housing development, and just completely filled. I watched over years. It is now a monoculture. It's a field of calorie pear, and nothing is growing underneath it. And it can grow in a wide range of soils, and it grows very quickly. So this is one I really believe we can get ahead of. And some of you may have heard about a bounty that was offered. That program was it started in Guilford County, it was so popular, they had to shut it down. I think they exceeded their order of, you know, for every calorie pear you brought in, you would get the equivalent of a native tree. So they've had to put a pause on it, but do plan to resume it. So these are, you know, creative ways to engage the public to remove these, a tree like this. We talked a little bit about Polonia, princess tree, empress tree, and it's still available on the internet. Catalogs are selling this tree. those sprouts, 15 feet in a single season. It was brought here as an ornamental. It responds very quickly to timber harvest, prescribed fire or wildfire, and it can creep into forests.
Is that what's blooming right now?
That's what's, yes,
Yeah.
that's what's blooming right now.
I always admire it.
Yeah, everyone, yeah, people, it is, it's a beautiful, but, we have native alternatives that we can use. If it didn't spread so rapidly, have all these negative effects, it would be wonderful. But unfortunately, think about a leaf 1 to 3 feet long and how much light energy that it can capture and grow so quickly and shade out all the other, native plants that are around. Here's the really scary parts. One tree can produce over 20 million seeds in a year. And those seeds can travel more than 2 miles. They've also believed that if there's the perfect storm, that they can go hundreds of miles. You've seen all those capsules too in the wintertime. It's just amazing. These tiny little seeds get blown long distances. Chinese privet, there's a bush right up the hill here. Lots of fruit. But the nutritional value of those is not as good as some natives, and oftentimes birds avoid them. See, I put will eat when there's nothing else around, but still they will eat them and they will move and they will shade out other plants. They're pretty, but like I said, there are native alternatives. Japanese honeysuckle creates these dense, thick mats that can strangle and shade out other plants. The birds and some mammals will eat them. Again, it's kind of a last resort food. But yeah, they were brought here. Here's an example, one that was brought for erosion control and as an ornamental. And those can get really large as well.
Joanne,
Yes.
are there other honeysuckles that are native, because they're all over the place?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. I have a native honeysuckle at home. There's a trumpet. It has a bright, it's almost like a coral pink.
It's on Merrimum Avenue,
Mhm.
when you go into Asheville, it's on the right. Yeah, it just goes up a pole.
Yes.
If you want some.
It can become invasive.
Yes, it can become invasive, and that's an example where a native one, and the one that I have at home, I've got to prune it back, and I have it in a contained area so it doesn't, spread. But as I was leaving this morning, the hummingbirds were just buzzing around, it's in flower. But I know I have fond memories of there's such fragrant flowers, and taking the nectar out and as a kid. English ivy is another problem. And again, another one, it's spread by birds. It actually we often don't see those, but when it grows up into the tops of the trees, those fruits, there's more sun up there. And the birds will eat those and disperse that and totally suppress anything growing in the forest floor. I've mentioned, so these are ones, including calorie pear, that we can stay on top of, that we can help reduce. Japanese knotweed, any streams that we have, this is a real problem. So they can grow up to more than 10 feet. They have an incredible root system. They have it's like a bowl. I dug these up at my property. I have one little patch that I've been working on, but they have this thick bulb and then shoot out all these root, they're called rhizomes. And they get established. They are really, since they're along streams, have a lot of impacts on stream quality. And if you're a fisherman, burning bush, I'll just talk, that's another one that we can all work on controlling and not planting.
So nurseries.
And that's the other thing, trying, but you know, it's their bread and butter, and it's a huge challenge. Before, I was in Ohio before I moved here, and I worked with the Ohio Invasive Plant Council, and it took us about 10 years to get the nursery industry in Ohio to start to ban things like burning bush, butterfly weed, a number of things. And it's definitely a challenge for sure to get people to stop planting them. They have this hollow stem. This is a real problem for wildlife in wet, moist areas. There are some medicinal properties, so maybe that could be a way to harvest it and make some money off of it, but I'm not going to advocate that because then somebody will want to plant it. So this is just, there's a lot here, but just to highlight this one plant which grows, it's amazing. I take 23A north of here, and all along the stream, along 23A, it's filled with knotweed. So I mentioned before, impacts on fish. It changes how much nitrogen is available for plants and going into the stream. Studies have shown that green frogs, they don't forage as quickly. They can't find as many insects because of the change in the composition, this monoculture. The invertebrates, that leaf litter that goes into the stream doesn't feed the mayflies, the dragonfly larvae, and all those, which then impact this big cycle, that food web. And then it actually can alter the pH of the soil and accumulates potassium. If you're a gardener, you know how critical that is for growth. So this is just one plant, just some highlights of all the impacts that it can have. And think about the cascade effects of those. Another emerging problem is this Japanese stilt grass, and that's one that came here, I mentioned earlier, as packing material for porcelain in China. And they would just throw it out. They didn't, you know, people didn't know back then in the 1900s. And it is coming into areas, now it's on mowing equipment, on trucks, on harvesting equipment, and the seed can stay and be in gravel, and it is very detrimental to any of like the spring flowering ephemerals. They'll come in and won't be able to get established. And animals can eat it. It doesn't have any food value for them. And those seeds just hang around forever. So this is one, see that whitish mid-vein. It is an annual, but those seeds, right now, I didn't bring a sample, it's just these little tiny things, but a whole carpet and nothing else as grows around there. I mentioned burning bush. This escaped into a forest. And I have that problem on my own property. When we bought it, there were 3 huge euonymus shrubs. I've cut them down, but I can see all the little seedlings through our right of way. And I'm working on pulling those out because they will shade out, and they're shade tolerant other species. I haven't seen in Madison County much autumn olive, but this was one that was introduced for wildlife. And it will exclude and shade out everything. They put it in a lot, I saw a real problem in Ohio where there's a lot of coal production, where they did surface mine reclamation and just planted it, and now nothing else will grow, and it is definitely a huge problem. So that's a lot of doom and gloom, but so what can we do? One, I appreciate all of you being here to become better informed citizens of how we can work to keep a better balance outdoors in our ecosystems. And I have to commend the Marshall Library and the friends who started this Native Gardens initiative. And one of the developers, the Inception, is sitting right here, and she's a great resource to reach out to Bobby. And we hope our plan is to convert and adopt that here at the Mars Hill Library. But it's a wonderful resource, both to physically walk those gardens and to see how beautiful they are. They're not, native plants are just as beautiful in their own way as some of these non-natives. And lots of great resources to understand and identify some of the native plants and some of the problem plants, the non-natives. The North Carolina Forest Service is a great resource, as well as the Cooperative Extension Program. There's so much great information out there, but it is a bit overwhelming. I brought over my own personal copies. You can take a look at these, but you can get these electronically. Some really wonderful resources from the Forest Service and how to manage those. This is a wonder, and I forgot to bring my copy, but I highly recommend this if you want to learn about invasive plants. You open it up on one page, is the invasive plant. On the other page is the native one or the equivalent, like bittersweet, for an example. There is a native bittersweet that is being displaced by the Oriental or the Asiatic bittersweet. And it gives the characteristics of how you can identify the native from the non-native and help to promote the native one. Highly recommend that. I carry that around with me. The University of Georgia has a center for invasive species and ecosystem health. A fabulous resource, anywhere from identifying and learning more about the species, but also, as a landowner or homeowner, you could, there are tools where you could map where you have invasives. If you treat them and you go back and you check, because oftentimes when you treat these invasives, whether if you cut them or if you chemically treat them, oftentimes you have to do a follow-up because they're so aggressive and they may not get killed the first time around. But a lot of great information there. So what can we do as landowners and homeowners? How can we be proactive? So actively monitoring what you have on your property, talking to your neighbors. If you see some, say you have one of these nearby, it's going to come right over to work. And sometimes that's really difficult because there may be sentimental value associated with that shrub or tree or plant, or just don't get anywhere. But I would say, we can try. That's all we can do. We help to educate our neighbors, knowing what is out there. So I would say build that awareness of invasive plants, and there's lots of tools. That's where the extension office comes in, or the Forest Service. Hey, you send a picture, or there are tools like Has anybody used iNaturalist
Mhm.
at all? That's a wonderful tool, and there are also ones specifically for invasive plants as well. You can take a photo, upload it, and it will tell you with some pretty good certainty if what it is. So if it's an invasive plant that you don't recognize and it's identified, that's the time to get rid of it, when you only have one or two, not thousands of them. Keeping equipment clean. Stilt grass is an example. When you mowing is one of the ways that Japanese stilt grass gets moved around. Trying to get it before it starts to produce seeds and flowers. Because there's one, as I had demonstrated, those seeds, they're spread by birds or by wind. If you can get it before they flower and seed, that will help. One of the things, some of the research I did was for the Ailanthus, the stink tree, was to identify, map out. This was in forests. We actually used helicopters, and those seeds of the Ailanthus tree stay on the persist through the winter. And we went out and we mapped where those were, and then crews went in and herbicided the female trees so that we would eliminate seeds from being produced and spread. If you have a tract of land and you're going to either do a timber harvest or say some disturbance, get rid of those problem plants before you do a planned disturbance. And focus on those. It's so much easier to remove one or two plants in a large area. And being vigilant. The sooner you can identify it and get rid of it, the easier it's going to be to control it and to have a positive impact. And that goes with not planting invasives. So as we said, an ounce of prevention is definitely worth a pound of cure. You have to, the one thing, you have to be patient, you have to be persistent, and sometimes creative of how you're going to eliminate these problem plants. And of course, remaining positive is so critical. Because otherwise, we could just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, that's it. But I've got too much of a bone. I'm a dog with a bone. I'm not going to give up. So just to summarize, especially in the spring or in the fall, it's so much easier, especially in the spring, when they start to leave out early. Even if that may not be the best time to remove them, you could flag them or map them and go back later to remove them. I mentioned using phone apps and guides. And I can't, this is so important to try to get to it as quickly as possible. And here's one, actually, I don't know, last summer I saw in Asheville on Broadway, they were using goats to suppress and remove invasive plants. And so there are creative ways of controlling. And there's a lot of active research, knowing how long they have to be in there, rotating them out, etc. So we do have ways of doing that. So as far as what you can do, spread the word, talk to your neighbors, volunteer. There's lots of opportunities to help control. Planting natives, be on the lookout. Don't transport to other places and to discourage the use of invasives.